The crystal chandelier above the ballroom fractured the light into 1,000 dancing rainbows. But for Grace, the room was suddenly losing oxygen. Just moments after her mentor's hand had rested on her shoulder in a fatherly blessing, she found herself staring at a single rounding error on her monitor that made the floor beneath her designer heels feel like thin ice. The dry, rhythmic snap of her keyboard was the only sound in the silent office, as she watched millions of dollars intended for the city's poorest vanish into a digital fog of offshore accounts, all stamped with the one signature she trusted above all others. The scent of expensive perfume still clung to her skin when she reached the parking garage, but it was quickly replaced by the sharp, chemical sting of cut hydraulic fluid. As she climbed into her car, the brake pedal hit the floorboard with a sickening, hollow thud, and the vehicle began a silent, deadly roll toward the concrete wall. Through the windshield, a motionless silhouette watched from the shadows of a reinforced pillar, his gaze heavy and unblinking. In that heartbeat, Grace realized the promotion wasn't a career milestone. It was a velvet-lined trap, and the people clapping for her an hour ago were now waiting for her to stop breathing. Grace O'Connor stood beneath a massive crystal chandelier that dominated the ceiling of the Milwaukee ballroom. The light fractured within the facets of her champagne glass, casting tiny, dancing rainbows across the silk of her evening gown. Around her, the air hung thick with the heavy scent of expensive perfumes, the savory aroma of roasted lobsters, and the faint, waxy undertone of hundreds of flickering candles. Colleagues in stiff tuxedos and shimmering dresses formed a dense ring around her, their palms frequently grazing her elbows in gestures of practiced approval. The collective hum of voices merged into a relentless, rhythmic drone, punctuated only by the sharp chime of crystal toasts and sudden bursts of sycophantic laughter. Grace nodded, maintaining a flawless, stationary smile, even as the bubbles of the vintage brute pricked her tongue with cold acidity. Her heels sank deep into the plush, midnight blue pile of the carpet, and her skin radiated a slight heat from the hundreds of expectant gazes pinned to her silhouette. The heavy, rhythmic tread of Charles Whitman echoed off the dark wood panels of the stage, a sound that commanded the room to fall into an immediate, vacuum-like silence. He adjusted the microphone with a clinical precision, and a sharp, electronic whistle sliced through the quiet, causing Grace to flinch involuntarily. Whitman rested his broad, manicured palm on the edge of the mahogany podium, his voice vibrating with a calculated, fatherly pride that filled every corner of the vast hall. He swept his authoritative gray eyes across the assembled elite of Milwaukee and finally spoke Grace's name, officially christening her the new head of Whitman and Associates. Sudden flashes from press cameras blinded her, transforming Whitman's robust silhouette into a jagged, dark smudge against the backdrop of the heavy gold curtains. The room erupted into a violent wave of applause that hammered against Grace's eardrums like the crashing surf of Lake Michigan during a November gale. Grace ascended the stairs to the stage, the cool friction of her silk dress brushing against her thighs with every step. She gripped the edges of the podium, the texture of the polished, lacquered wood feeling solid and slightly oily beneath her fingertips. Her voice emerged steady and clear, the words of gratitude flowing with the ease of a melody rehearsed 1,000 times in the silence of her downtown apartment. She looked into the shining, hungry eyes of her subordinates, seeing in them the distorted reflection of her own hard-won triumph. Her lungs filled with the filtered air of the ballroom, and for a fleeting moment, the very space seemed to expand, granting her a sense of limitless reach. Grace paused, savoring the precise second when the world revolved exclusively around her, and the summit of her career finally sat beneath the soles of her designer pumps. The heavy oak door of her private office clicked shut, instantly severing the muffled thrum of the ongoing celebration in the foyer. Inside, the room smelled of ozone from the high-end computer towers and the comforting, musky scent of old leather chairs. Grace kicked off her heels, the chill of the parquet floor shocking her bare soles back to reality. On her desk, manila folders lay in surgical rows, prepared for the massive merger scheduled for the following morning. She clicked on the desk lamp, its narrow, concentrated beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate tiny dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Grace's fingers moved to the keyboard, the dry, rhythmic snap of the keys becoming the only pulse in the room. She opened the first digital file, settling in for the final verification of the figures that were supposed to cement her new life. Grace's eyes snagged on a lonely, unremarkable figure in the expenditure column of the firm's primary charitable foundation. It missed the total sum by a fraction of a percent. A rounding error, perhaps, but enough to make her rub the bridge of her nose in irritation. She pulled up the reports from 5 years prior, her mouse clicking with a steady, metronomic pace as she scrolled through endless, gray tables of data. She began to notice a pattern. Small, seemingly insignificant sums leaking away through various third-party vendors, whose names felt vaguely familiar, like names heard in a dream. The tip of her tongue touched her dry lips as she cross-referenced the payment dates. A slight draft from the air conditioner made the hair on her arms stand up as the inconsistencies began to knit themselves into an organized, deliberate system of theft. She froze, staring at the high-resolution monitor where a complex web of shell companies and paper-thin entities began to unravel. Millions of dollars, funds explicitly earmarked for soup kitchens and homeless shelters across Milwaukee, were dissolving into the digital fog of offshore accounts right before her eyes. A bitter lump of bile rose in her throat, and her heart began to beat a hollow, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every click of the scroll wheel revealed a new magnitude of larceny, all of it expertly camouflaged as administrative overhead or logistical fees. Grace saw how the foundation's accounts were being systematically bled dry, leaving only crumbs for the people the firm claimed to protect. Cold sweat broke out across her forehead as she realized this ingenious parasitic scheme had been functioning for decades, right under her nose. Grace clicked on an encrypted attachment deep within a nested folder and saw a familiar, bold flourish in the corner of the document. Charles Whitman's digital signature glowed on the screen, a neon brand of authenticity on a stack of fictitious invoices. She felt the floor beneath her swivel and tilt, the image of her wise, noble mentor shattering into a million jagged shards of glass. Whitman had constructed a gargantuan financial pyramid, using the veil of philanthropy to shroud his predatory machinations. Grace glanced up at the framed portrait of Whitman hanging on the far wall. It seemed as if his painted eyes were tracking her every breath, mocking her discovery. Her hands began to shake with a fine, uncontrollable tremor as the sheer scale of the betrayal finally crashed into her consciousness. She pulled a slim, silver flash drive from her desk drawer and slotted it into the laptop port with a faint, metallic click. The blue loading bar crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness, while Grace copied the incriminating bank statements and the digital copies of Whitman's signatures. The cooling fan of the computer hummed with a strained, high-pitched whine, sounding to her ears like a frantic warning. She clenched her fists so tightly that her nails bit into the soft flesh of her palms. When the transfer finished, she tucked the drive into a concealed interior pocket of her leather handbag. Grace knew the quiet, predictable trajectory of her life had ended the moment those files finished copying. She now possessed the one secret capable of leveling the Whitman empire. Grace pushed through the heavy glass doors of the office tower and inhaled the raw, damp night air of the city. Her footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the empty concrete of the parking structure, the echoes bouncing off the low ceilings. Dim, flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows that danced across the pavement like skeletal fingers. She hugged her bag to her side, feeling the hard, rectangular shape of the flash drive through the leather. A sudden, sharp spike of anxiety tightened her chest, forcing her to spin around at the sound of a dry leaf skittering across the floor. The silence of the garage felt fake and predatory, as if an enemy lurked behind every reinforced concrete pillar. She accelerated her pace, the cold sensation of fear sliding down the back of her neck. She skidded to a halt halfway to her car, spotting a flicker of movement to her left. In the dense, ink-black shadow between two massive support columns stood the figure of a man, his silhouette nearly invisible against the dark masonry. The stranger didn't move, but Grace could feel the weight of a heavy, unblinking gaze pressing against her skin. She could only make out the broad set of his shoulders and the low brim of a cap pulled down to obscure his features. The air around her seemed to thicken, making it difficult to draw a full breath into her lungs. She fumbled for her keys in her pocket, hearing nothing but her own ragged breathing and the distant, muffled roar of the city outside. The stranger continued to watch her, making no move to approach, which terrified her far more than an outright attack. Grace dove into the driver's seat and slammed the door with a violent thud, immediately hitting the central lock. She jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine coughed into its familiar, reassuring rumble. She shifted the gear lever into reverse and pressed the brake pedal to clear the parking space. Her foot met no resistance at all. The pedal hit the floorboard with a soft, sickening thud. Panic flared in her throat as she pumped the brake frantically, but the car began to roll backward down the slight incline of the garage floor. The sharp, chemical scent of cut hydraulic fluid filled her nostrils, confirming her worst fear. Her fingers clawed at the leather handle of the emergency brake, and she yanked the lever upward with a series of loud, metallic ratchets. The rear tires shrieked, biting into the concrete as the car jerked to a violent halt, throwing Grace forward so hard the seatbelt bruised her collarbone. The metal of the front bumper stopped mere inches from a gray concrete wall stained with patches of damp mold. Grace sat in the vibrating silence, listening to the frantic ticking of the cooling engine and her own gasping breaths. Her arms felt numb, and a hot, heavy pulse throbbed in her temples as she stared at the wall. An hour later, Grace threw open the double doors of Whitman's private study, the wood striking the brass stoppers with a thunderous crack. The room smelled of expensive pipe tobacco and polished sandalwood. She hurled a stack of printed reports onto the lacquered surface of his desk, the papers fan-folding across the wood like a deck of cards. The black ink of the embezzlement charts looked like toxic stains against the pristine office environment. She leaned her weight onto the desk, her forearms trembling with suppressed rage. Charles Whitman didn't even blink. He simply set down his gold fountain pen and looked at her with a calm that chilled her to the bone. Whitman rose slowly, smoothing the lapels of his bespoke suit, his shadow stretching across the desk to swallow her. His voice sounded like the slow grinding of tectonic plates when he spoke of her being a mere pawn in a much larger game. He slid several folders toward her, pointing to the bottom of the contracts where her own elegant signature sat in blue ink. A cold shiver raced down Grace's spine as she recognized the distinctive loops of her handwriting on documents she had signed without reading during the flurry of her promotion. Whitman offered a thin ghost of a smile, and Grace felt the trap snap shut with the finality of a prison cell door. Back in her own office, Grace typed her password with frantic, clumsy fingers, but the keys felt like they were made of lead. Instead of her desktop, a bright crimson window appeared on the screen, bearing the corporate seal and a curt notification that her access had been revoked for security reasons. She heard the internal fans of the laptop scream as the system purged her credentials. The cursor froze, a dead point of light on the screen, and she realized Whitman's security team had erased her digital existence in a matter of seconds. The monitor went black, becoming a dark mirror in which she saw her own pale, terrified face staring back. In the long, marble-floored corridor, Grace spotted the familiar bob of red hair belonging to Sarah, her personal assistant. She took a step toward her, but stopped when she saw Sarah looking guiltily over her shoulder. Sarah's fingers were tightly gripped around the slim frame of the company smartphone Grace had left charging on her desk. Grace watched from the shadows as Sarah handed the device to the head of corporate security, a massive man whose bulk blocked the light from the hallway windows. A wave of nausea hit Grace at the sight of that quiet, calculated betrayal. Sarah looked away, hiding her eyes behind her glasses, and Grace understood that there wasn't a single soul left in the building she could trust. Grace turned the key in the lock of her apartment door with practiced caution, but the bolt was already retracted. Inside her living room, the air smelled of stale sweat and the cheap, chemical scent of rubber masks. Two men in dark coveralls were systematically dumping the contents of her bookshelves onto the rug, turning her personal history into a pile of debris. She watched as one of them sliced open the lining of her favorite armchair, searching for the physical copies of the reports. The sound of splintering wood echoed in her chest like a physical blow. She stood paralyzed in the doorway, not daring to make a sound as the intruders methodically dismantled her world. She threw open the window frame in her bedroom, a blast of cold air carrying the scent of wet asphalt and dumpster trash into the room. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of her bedroom door being kicked off its hinges. She swung her legs over the sill, the rusted iron of the fire escape burning her palms with the bite of autumn cold. The metal steps clattered under her weight as she dove into the thick, oily darkness of the alleyway. She ran without direction, her dress snagging on the jagged wire of a chain-link fence. She heard the heavy stomp of boots on the iron grates above, but the shadows of the Milwaukee backstreets swallowed her whole, shielding her from the angry shouts of the men upstairs. Grace stopped in front of a glowing electronics store window where dozens of televisions were broadcasting Charles Whitman's face. She watched as he pressed a silk handkerchief to his eyes, telling a bank of microphones about Grace's tragic mental breakdown. The scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen screamed about millions in embezzlement linked to her accounts and her unstable psychological state. A cold sweat broke out between her shoulder blades. Whitman's voice from the speakers sounded soft and paternal, expertly painting her as a criminal and a madwoman before the entire city. She instinctively pulled her hood low, hiding her face from the casual glances of the late-night pedestrians. She slid her plastic debit card into the slot of an ATM, and the machine began a long, labored whirring sound. On the screen, instead of her balance, a stark notification appeared stating that her funds had been frozen by federal order. She hammered at the buttons, but the keypad was dead to her touch. With a quiet, mechanical click, the machine swallowed her card, leaving her standing on the sidewalk with nothing. She felt her fingers go numb, and a tight, painful knot formed in her stomach. Her entire world had been reduced to the leather bag on her shoulder, containing only a few crumpled bills she had tucked away for an emergency that had finally arrived. Grace crossed the threshold of a nameless motel room where the air smelled of industrial bleach and old cooking grease. The walls were covered in faded, peeling floral wallpaper that sagged at the corners. She laid her last few banknotes on the sticky surface of the nightstand. The desk clerk, a man with dull, disinterested eyes, took the money without looking at her and handed over a heavy brass key. Grace sat on the edge of the squeaky bed, the springs digging into her thighs. The dim bulb in the ceiling flickered, casting long, rhythmic shadows into the dusty corners of the room. And she realized this wretched box was now her only fortress. She cautiously peeled back the edge of the heavy gray curtain, trying not to disturb the fabric. On the rain-slicked parking lot below, directly under a buzzing street lamp, sat a black sedan with deep-tinted windows. She recognized the predatory lines of the grille. The same car that had been a constant shadow since she left the office. The vehicle sat motionless, but she felt as though she could hear the low, subterranean thrum of its idling engine through the glass. She recoiled from the window, pressing her spine against the cold wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, and the crushing realization that her sanctuary had been found paralyzed her. She glanced at her wristwatch, the second hand sweeping with a relentless, mechanical pace. The numbers on the dial felt like a death sentence. 20 hours remained until the merger ceremony began. She knew that once Whitman placed his final seal on those documents, every trace of his crimes would be legally buried under layers of corporate restructuring. The weight of the deadline pressed in on her, a physical force that made the small room feel like it was shrinking. Grace flinched when a series of heavy, measured thuds struck the thin wood of her motel door, making the deadbolt rattle in its socket. Standing in the doorway, framed by the sickly purple glow of a neon sign, was Marcus, Whitman's head of security. Rainwater dripped from his black leather coat, leaving dark, oily trails on the linoleum floor. He held out a thick envelope made of cream-colored vellum, smelling faintly of Whitman's signature tobacco. Inside, Grace found a card embossed with the gold seal of the Elysium Club. Her fingertips went numb as Marcus informed her, in a dry, robotic tone, of the time for her reconciliation dinner, his eyes never leaving hers. She stepped into the private dining room of the club, where the scent of roasted venison clashed with the aroma of ancient cognac. Heavy velvet drapes smothered the sounds of the city, plunging the room into a thick, artificial silence. Charles Whitman sat in a deep wing-back chair, his fingers slowly rotating a crystal snifter, causing the amber liquid to swirl against the glass. The orange light of the fireplace danced across the silver cutlery and the blindingly white tablecloth. Whitman gestured toward the chair opposite him, and Grace felt the rigid wood of the chair press against her spine. He filled a second glass, the sound of the pouring liquid unnervingly loud in the vacuum of the room. Whitman slid a leather-bound folder across the table with a soft, dry hiss. Grace looked down at the tables, seeing long rows of figures perfectly aligned in columns. She saw Cayman Island bank account numbers registered in her name and transaction dates that perfectly matched her vacation history over the last 3 years. Her heart skipped a beat as she noticed copies of her own ID cards attached to every fraudulent wire transfer. Whitman tapped the paper with a manicured nail, a sound that reminded her of a ticking clock. She realized then that Whitman hadn't just stolen money. He had spent years weaving a digital shroud that made her the primary architect of his crimes. He placed a heavy gold pen on top of the final audit report. Grace read the lines where she was expected to confess to management errors and take full responsibility for the missing millions. Whitman leaned forward, the scent of his minty cologne filling her space as he promised her a one-way ticket to Zurich and a 7-figure offshore account in exchange for her signature. She stared at the gold nib of the pen, which glinted under the chandelier like a hornet's stinger. Her palm grew slick with sweat, and her throat constricted with the sheer, naked cynicism of the ultimatum. Grace shifted her gaze slightly and saw 2 massive shadows reflected in the glass of a nearby china cabinet. Whitman's guards were stationed at the entrance, arms crossed, their faces lost in the gloom. She noticed one of them adjusting his cuff, revealing the cold, metallic glint of a sidearm. It became blindingly clear that Whitman would never let a witness of her caliber simply walk away to an airport. The air in the room felt too heavy to breathe, and Whitman's smile was a frozen mask. She knew that the moment the ink dried on that paper, she would become a liability to be discarded in a dark alley. She suddenly gripped the edge of the table, faking a convulsive gasp as her shoulders began to shake. With a violent, calculated swing of her arm, she struck the heavy crystal water carafe. Ice and freezing water cascaded into Whitman's lap, causing him to yelp and recoil in shock. In the split second he was distracted by his soaked trousers, Grace bolted, knocking her chair over. She sprinted past the stunned guards toward a nondescript service door behind the tapestry. She burst into the sweltering heat of the kitchen, dodging cooks and the smell of burnt garlic, and threw herself through the black maw of the rear exit, ignoring Whitman's enraged bellows behind her. Grace hit the street, where the freezing rain of Milwaukee immediately soaked through her clothes. Her soles slipped on the oily puddles as she dove into the labyrinthine alleys between the brick warehouses of the Third Ward. Behind her, she heard the shriek of tires and the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on wet asphalt. She squeezed through a gap in a rusted fence, the metal tearing the fabric of her jacket. The shadows of shipping containers loomed over her like giants, and the echoes of the guards' shouts fractured against the concrete walls. She ran until her lungs burned with the intake of cold air, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. She emerged onto a brightly lit intersection and waved frantically at an approaching taxi. The car slowed, and she saw the driver's face through the rain-streaked window. The man's eyes flicked from Grace to the smartphone mounted on his dashboard, where her face was displayed under a headline about a local fugitive. Grace saw his eyes widen with fear as he recognized the mad embezzler from the news. Instead of unlocking the doors, the driver yanked the wheel and floored the accelerator, drenching Grace in a plume of dirty street water. She was left standing alone on the empty road, watching the red taillights vanish into the fog. She dove under the rusting iron arches of a railroad trestle, pressing her back against the cold, crumbling concrete. A few yards away, the black sedan cruised by with predatory slowness, its searchlight cutting through the dark to illuminate every crack in the masonry. Grace clutched her bag to her chest, trying to stifle the sound of her heart, which felt loud enough to give her away. The smell of wet iron and grease filled her nose. The beam of light swept across the tips of her shoes and moved on, leaving her in the safety of the shadows. She waited until the hum of the engine faded into the distance before she allowed herself to breathe. Grace fumbled through her bag until her fingers hit a familiar, rigid rectangle of plastic. She pulled out an old system administrator's pass with the corporate logo, a card she had accidentally kept from her early days in the IT department. On the badge, she saw her younger face, back when her access rights had been nearly absolute. She felt the grainy texture of the magnetic stripe. She realized that if the codes hadn't been purged, this piece of plastic was the only key capable of opening the technical service hatches, bypassing Whitman's main security checkpoints. A spark of desperate resolve lit her eyes as she gripped the pass. She peered around the corner of a building at the glass skyscraper of the corporate office, its summit lost in the low-hanging clouds. The plaza was a sea of blue and red police lights and the blinding white glare of news van spotlights. She saw lines of private security in tactical vests checking IDs at every entrance. Black limousines began to line up at the main entrance, dropping off investors in heavy wool coats. Grace knelt before the rusted metal grate of a technical manhole, hidden behind a row of overflowing dumpsters in the back alley. Her fingers dug into the cold iron bars, and with a strained groan of metal, the lid gave way, revealing the dark opening of a concrete shaft. She squeezed inside, feeling the sticky touch of cobwebs and the smell of damp earth on her face. She pressed the old admin pass to a dusty reader inside the ventilation shaft. The red LED flickered, then turned a dull, steady green. Grace crawled into the narrow metal duct, where the vibration of massive turbines hummed in her bones and the red lines of laser sensors sat motionless just inches from her shoulder. She dropped silently onto the tiled floor of the server room, where rows of black cabinets blinked with thousands of blue lights. The air was dry and freezing, thick with the static electricity that made the hair on her neck stand on end. She pulled a magnetic key from her pocket and swiped it across the video surveillance panel. The monitors on the wall immediately dissolved into gray static. She froze, listening to the monotonous whine of the cooling fans, which masked all outside noise. She moved between the humming racks like a ghost until her fingers found the primary uplink for the building's broadcast system. She dropped to her knees, opening her laptop on the cold metal floor. Her fingers flew across the keys, entering lines of green code that glowed against the dark screen. She plugged the cable into the central hub, and the progress bar for her bypass script began to fill with agonizing slowness. Suddenly, the heavy thud of boots sounded outside the server room door. Marcus's men. Grace held her breath, pressing herself against the cold steel of a server rack. She watched the door handle slowly turn downward and then click back into place. A single drop of cold sweat rolled down her spine. Grace pushed open the massive doors of the grand conference hall, and the light from dozens of chandeliers struck her with blinding force. She walked down the center aisle, her head bowed, staring at her ruined shoes caked in alleyway mud. Charles Whitman froze mid-sentence at the podium, his microphone hand hovering in the air. She felt the collective weight of hundreds of investors and the lenses of television cameras swiveling toward her. She pulled her torn jacket tight around her, making sure the room saw her trembling fingers and her hollow, hunted expression. Whitman straightened his shoulders, his face a mask of practiced pity for his fallen protégé. Whitman made a grand, sweeping gesture, and the crowd parted for Grace as if she were a plague victim. She approached the podium, smelling his expensive cologne and the smug aura of victory he radiated. With a predatory smile, he handed her the heavy gold pen, its barrel feeling like a sliver of ice in her hand. She saw the final audit papers before her, the paragraphs detailing her sole guilt highlighted in bold. Whitman gave her a subtle, firm nudge toward the table, his fingers digging painfully into her elbow. The flashes of the cameras strobed around her, capturing the moment of her supposed total surrender. She leaned over the document, hovering the pen over the signature line, but the nib only scratched the paper without leaving a mark. Her other hand slipped into her pocket, her thumb finding the touchscreen of her phone. She made a sharp, flicking motion with her wrist, triggering a remote access command she had coded in the server room. In the sudden silence of the hall, a sharp electronic chime echoed from the overhead speakers. Grace stood up straight, tossing the gold pen aside so it clattered across the parquet floor. She looked directly into the lens of the main broadcast camera, her eyes devoid of any trace of fear. The massive LED screens behind Whitman flickered to black before erupting in a violent crimson. Grace watched as the screens began to scroll through endless lists of offshore accounts, all tied to Whitman's personal access codes. The hall filled with Whitman's voice, distorted by the recording but unmistakable, promising to grind Grace into dust if she didn't take the fall. Grace watched the investors' faces go slack with shock while journalists began to scribble furiously. Whitman spun around to face the screen, and Grace saw dark, angry blotches of red bloom on his neck as his skin turned a sickly, ashen gray. Whitman let out a guttural roar and lunged at Grace, his fingers clawing for the microphone. Grace stepped back with clinical calm as a wave of investors surged forward, cutting him off from the podium. Dozens of digital recorders were shoved into his face, the flashes now hitting his eyes with a merciless frequency. He tried to shove through the wall of bodies, screaming incoherent threats, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of a room demanding answers. Grace stood in the eye of the storm, feeling the crushing weight of the last few days finally begin to lift from her shoulders. The massive doors at the back of the hall swung open, admitting a team of men in dark coats with federal badges pinned to their lapels. Grace reached into her pocket and placed the silver flash drive into the hand of the lead investigator. The metal was still warm from her own body heat. At the same time, she noticed Marcus and the rest of the security team slipping out through a side exit, abandoning their boss to the chaos. She watched them go, feeling the empire of Whitman and Associates crumble like wet sand. The agents took Whitman by the elbows, and the twin clicks of the handcuffs were the clearest sounds Grace had ever heard. Whitman, disheveled and wild-eyed, paused for a second in front of Grace as the agents led him away. He hissed that she had destroyed the company and put thousands of innocent people out of work. Grace felt his hot breath on her face, smelling of bile and old cognac. She didn't say a word, merely looking into his bloodshot eyes where a raw, primal terror now flickered. She saw the last of his legendary confidence drain away, leaving behind a fragile, broken old man in a ruined suit. Grace gave a small, slow shake of her head, a gesture that ended their decade-long history. Grace stood by the panoramic window on the top floor, looking down at the plaza where the tiny figures of court bailiffs were already moving. She watched as red wax seals were placed on the doors of the main vault, and the first of the seizure vans lined up at the curb. On a nearby monitor, a news anchor announced with visible excitement the unprecedented return of millions to the city's shelters. Grace stood alone in the darkening office, the silence of the building finally feeling peaceful rather than predatory. She looked out toward the gray expanse of Lake Michigan, knowing her career was over. But her life had finally begun.